Welcome to Infidelity Diaries. Explore the secrets and stories of infidelity with us. Sometimes life presents us with surprises that are impossible to predict. If everything seems familiar and calm, and suddenly in one moment, as if a lightning bolt hit a clear sky, something changes. At first it's imperceptible on the edge of perception, but with every second that feeling intensifies, growing inside until it engulfs your entire being. That's exactly how I felt that evening when Michael, my husband's father, came to visit us. I am Emily, an ordinary woman living in a small town in Oregon. I am married to James, and we have 2 children to whom we have dedicated all our energy. Our house is situated right by the forest, and sometimes when I am alone, I feel as though the trees are whispering to each other, discussing something secret and ancient. But as I recently realized, the real secrets are not hidden in the forest, but much closer among those we consider to be our loved ones. Michael arrived unexpectedly. Though he had informed us of his visit, we were accustomed to his rare visits. He's a person engrossed in his work, employed in another state, but he always finds time to visit us. That evening I greeted him at the door, feeling a slight unease. That washer to explain. He had always been a reserved, calm person, but at that moment I sensed something new in his gaze, something that made me freeze for a moment. After dinner we sat in the living room. James was talking about work. The children had already gone to bed, and the fire in the fireplace was a witness to our conversations. I tried not to look at Michael, but I felt his presence with every cell of my body. His gaze seemed like an invisible thread pulling me, and despite the absurdity of this thought, I couldn't shake the feeling that some invisible game was unfolding between us. I tried to focus on James's words, but every time I lifted my eyes, I encountered Michael's gaze. There was something strange, incomprehensible, yet simultaneously magnetic about it. It wasn't just curiosity, it was something more, something that made me ponder what lay behind his reserved smile. Night was deepening outside, and the shadows in the room were growing longer. I could feel the atmosphere changing, filling with attention. I couldn't explain that evening was different from others, but I couldn't yet understand exactly how. When the conversations dwindled and James suggested we all retire to our rooms, I suddenly felt a strange sense of disappointment. It was absurd, but I caught myself wanting to stay, to continue feeling the strange attraction that had filled the room. But of course, I couldn't allow myself that. I silently got up and followed my husband, leaving Michael alone with his doubts. The night was long. I tossed and turned in bed, trying to fall asleep, but my thoughts kept returning to Michael, his gaze, his calmness. None of it left moment. I could hear his voice in my head, a voice I somehow couldn't forget. I tried to convince myself that it was all just imagination, that I was worked up from fatigue and stress, but it didn't help. Inside me something was stirring, something I was afraid to name aloud. The next morning I tried to acknowledge James, and I had breakfast, discussed plans for the day, but I felt that Michael was watching me, as if trying to decipher my thoughts. It felt like a game where no one had spoken thrills aloud, yet both participants knew it was underway. When James left for work and the children went to school, I was left alone with Michael. The house was quiet, only the wind outside swaying the trees, creating a sense of coziness and tranquility. I tried to focus on the household chores, but my thoughts kept drifting back to him. I found myself listening for his footsteps, the sound he made, and at some point I realized I was waiting for our encounter. He entered the kitchen while I was washing dishes. His presence was so overwhelming that I felt a pang of nervousness in my chest. I didn't dare turn around, but I knew he was standing nearby, and this closeness made my heart race. Emily, his voice came unexpectedly, and I flinched. He was as calm as always, but there was a hidden note in his tone that made me catch my breath. I turned around and met his gaze. He was closer than I had expected, and I felt a chill run down my spine. His eyes were full of mystery, as if he knew something I didn't understand. We stared at each other in silence, and in that minute I realized that something more than just a connection between a father-in-law and a daughter-in-law had developed between us. I wanted to say something, but the words stuck in my throat. We stood so close that I could hear his breathing, and that sensation enveloped me completely. Inside me a storm was brewing. I understood that something was happening that shouldn't be, but I couldn't stop. Every glance, every gesture from him drew me in, and I knew it wasn't just attraction. It was something else, something that was kindling slowly, like a fire smoldering gradually. Michael turned away first, as if giving me a chance to collect my thoughts, but I knew that this moment would linger in my memory for a long time. I continued with my tasks, but every moment of that day was permeated by his presence, his gazes, his voice. It was like a premonition of a storm that had yet to start, but had already captured all my attention. That day passed, leaving me with the feeling that something in my life had changed. I realized that what was happening was dangerous, but I couldn't resist it. Everything seemed So mundane, yet inside me an elusive force was growing, gradually taking over me entirely all day. I tried to find an explanation for my feelings, cleaning, cooking, household chores, all of it was supposed to distract me, but every time I was alone, my thoughts returned to Michael. I was agitated, but I didn't understand why it felt as though an invisible net was forming around me, tightening its grip with each passing day. When evening came and James returned from work, I tried to act as usual. We had dinner together, discussing everyday matters. James talked about some work issues, and I tried to listen, but my gaze kept falling on Michael, who also seemed to sense the hidden tension between Yash's calmness and silence became something mysterious and intriguing, as if he were waiting for me to make the first move. After dinner, James suggested going for a walk, but feeling tired and overwhelmed, I declined. He shrugged, kissed me on the forehead, and left, leaving me alone with Michael. It was a strange moment when the air in the room became heavy like before a storm. I didn't know what to say and felt a slight shiver overcoming numbly. Michael broke the silence, his voice calm but with an undertone of insistence that made me flinch. You've changed somehow. Is everything all right? The simple question made me tense up. I couldn't admit to him what I was feeling, as I didn't fully understand it myself, but his words, his concern for my state, were unexpected and worse desirable. Yes, everything is fine, I replied, trying to appear as calm as possible. I'm just a bit tired. Michael didn't say anything, but his gaze lingered on me longer than usual. In his eyes I saw questions to which I couldn't find answers. We fell back into silence, but the silence didn't feel awkward, rather it was filled with hidden tension, as if we were both waiting for something but hesitating to make the first move. At some point it became unbearable for me to be in the same room with him. I felt my heart start to race and my thoughts became tangled. I get up from the sofa, trying not to look at Michael, and headed towards the door. I'm gonna get some fresh air, I say, not looking back. He didn't reply, and I went outside, feeling the night air envelop me with its coolness. The forest around our house stood quiet and calm, with only a gentle breeze rustling the leaves. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart, and slowly walked along the path leading deeper into the forest. I needed to think to understand what was happening to me. This man, my husband's father, a man who had always seemed cold and distant, why was I now feeling something towards him that I couldn't explain? These thoughts tormented me, but they brought no clarity. I walked further into the forest, trying to sort out my thoughts. The path led me to a small pond whose existence I had almost forgotten. The water was dark and still, reflecting the night sky with its few stars. I sat down on a bench by the water, listening to the wind playing with the branches of the trees. In this solitude, I finally managed to calm down. I closed my eyes and allowed myself to forget about Michael, James, and all my worries for a moment. But the calm was short-lived. At some point, I heard footsteps behind me and tensed. Immediately opening my eyes, I saw a figure approaching. It was Michael. He came closer and sat down next to me on the bench without saying a word. His presence again made me nervous, but at the same time I felt something new igniting within me, a spark that I couldn't extinguish. We sat in silence side by side. The silence around us was complete, but in that silence I felt an invisible force flowing between us. It was like an electric current running across my skin, making my heart beat faster inside me. Two feelings struggled: an urge to leave and a fear of what might happen if I stayed. Michael slowly turned his head and looked at me. In his eyes I saw the same thing I felt myself: attraction, passion that he was hiding but had come too strong to ignore. He didn't say a word, but that look spoke more than any words could. I couldn't look away, couldn't leave. We were like two magnets drawn to each other despite all obstacles. I felt my breathing quicken, and I was afraid he would hear how fast my heart was beating at that moment. I felt frightened that I could no longer control myself, that the attraction to this man had become too strong. I knew that if I stayed here any longer, I wouldn't be able to resist anymore, but Michael, sensing my anxiety, broke the connection. First, he turned his gaze and looked at the dark surface of that bend. I felt the tension between us begin to dissipate, but along with it came disappointment. I wanted him to make the first move for the spark we both felt to ignite, but he might have understood that it was too dangerous. It's very peaceful here, Heffinally said, his voice calm and even again, as if nothing had happened. Yes, and nodded, trying to regain control. It's a good place to think. He looked at me again, and I realized that this moment was just the beginning of something more. Despite everything I felt, despite all the danger, I knew that this evening was only the first spark in the flame that would inevitably ignite. We stayed there for a while longer, until the night air began to chill us. Finally, I got up and Michael did the same. We walked back to the house in silence where our old lives awaited us, but I knew that this night had changed everything. When we returned, James was already asleep. I climbed into bed feeling the cold night air from the forest still tickling my skin. I closed my eyes, but sleep did not come. I lay there listening to James's quiet breathing and thought about how everything would soon change. This night had marked the beginning of something new, something dangerous, but I could not avoid it. My life would never be the same. And I could no longer stop what had begun. The next morning I woke up with the feeling that the night in the forest was not a dream, but a reality that was gradually taking over my life. Everything around me seemed strangely familiar, but also changed. I couldn't get rid of thoughts about Michael, about how we had sat by the pond, surrounded by silence and hidden passion. His image haunted me even as I tried to focus on ordinary tasks. James had left for work early in the morning, and once again I was alone in the house with Michael. The day began as usual. The kids went off to school. It took care of the cleaning, but everything around seemed painted in new, more vivid colors. In every step Michael took around the house, in every glance he cast, I felt something I had never noticed before. It was like an electric charge in the air that couldn't be ignored all day. I tried to avoid encountering him. I felt that if we were alone again, what had happened by the pond would repeat itself, and I wouldn't be able to resist any longer. Yet I still heard his footsteps in the neighboring rooms, and that feeling continued to envelop me like a suffocating fog. As evening approached with the sun already setting, I heard his voice calling me from the living room. It was calm, as if nothing had happened, but I felt it was merely a facade concealing something much deeper. I entered the room trying to appear confident, but inside I was trembling. Michael stood by the window looking out at the golden evening sky. I noticed him slightly turn his head towards me, catching the sound of my approaching steps. "Emily," he said quietly, as if testing my reaction to the sound of his voice. "Yes," I responded, trying to keep my voice steady, though I knew it was becoming increasingly difficult. He didn't answer right away, and I moved closer, unable to resist the unknown attraction. The room was filled with silence, and only the faint wind outside reminded us that the world beyond our home continued to move. I found myself next to him, closer than I had intended, and felt the air between us growing dense and palpable. Michael slowly turned to face me, and his eyes met mine. At that minute I realized that I could no longer run away. A fire was igniting between us that couldn't be extinguished. His gaze was so intense that I felt a shiver run through my body. "Why are you avoiding me?" he asked softly, as if knowing the answer but wanting to hear it from me. I took a deep breath, trying to gather my thoughts, but they scattered like sand through my fingers. I couldn't lie to him, couldn't pretend that everything was fine, because I'm afraid, I admitted, feeling my throat dry up. Michael nodded slowly, as if understanding what I meant. He took a step towards me, and I felt his hand touch mine. The touch was light, almost weightless, but it stirred a storm of emotions within me. I looked up, meeting his gaze, and realized that I could no longer resist. Michael moved closer, his breath brushing against my skin, and I couldn't look away. At that moment, there was only a thin line between us that was about to disappear. I didn't know how it would all end, but I knew one thing: you wanted it. I wanted him. He lifted his hand and gently caressed my cheek. The motion was so tender that I felt goosebumps running across my skin. My heart pounded so hard that I was afraid he might hear it. I couldn't hold back this feeling any longer. It had engulfed me completely. Michael leaned in closer, and time seemed to stop. I saw his eyes darken with passion as his lips slowly approached mine. I knew I should step back, stop this, but instead I took a step forward, feeling his hand tighten around my face, and finally his lips. To Shedman, it was more than just a kiss. It was a release from all the constraints, all the rules and prohibitions. His lips were soft and warm, and this kiss evoked such strong feelings in me that I had never experienced before. Everything inside me screamed that this was wrong, that I was making a huge mistake. But at that moment I couldn't stop. Michael pulled me closer, and I felt his arms wrapping around me as if trying to keep me from falling into the abyss. I had thrown myself into the kiss, was long and deep, full of the passion that had been hidden in both of us for so long. I responded with the same intensity with which he was kissing me, and I felt his hands moving across my body, stirring a wave of desire within me. I knew it was wrong. I knew this moment would change everything, but at that moment I couldn't think of anything else about how much I wanted this man who stood before me. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathing heavily, I couldn't believe what had just happened. My lips still burned from his kiss, and my heart raced as if I had run a marathon. We looked at each other, trying to grasp what we had just done. "Emily," Michael whispered, his voice filled with an uncertainty I had never heard before. "We shouldn't," but I didn't let him finish. I knew he was right, but I couldn't. I had never heard before. "We shouldn't," but I didn't let him finish. I knew he was right, but I couldn't. Let this moment end like this. I pulled him to me again, and our lips met once more, this time with even greater passion. This kiss was longer, hotter, and I felt his arms embracing me again, leaving me no chance to escape. We couldn't stop even if we wanted. To this moment was what we had both been waiting for, but we afraid to admit to ourselves. I knew this kiss would change everything, but I couldn't stop. I wanted him more than ever. Finally, when we pulled away from each other, I felt the world collapse. Around us, I realized that our lives would never be the same. This kiss had become a point of no return, and I didn't know where it would lead us, but I was sure of one thing: we could no longer go back. Michael slowly released me, his eyes still filled with passion, but also showing concern. I felt the tension between us, which could no longer be ignored. We both understood that we had made a huge mistake, but that knowledge couldn't stop what had begun. "We need to think," he said, and I nodded. Not knowing what to say en response, we stood there in that room filled with silence and tension, and I knew that this moment had changed everything. After our lips finally parted, a silence filled the air, laden with tension and unspoken words. I stood across from Michael, trying to grasp what had just happened. Everything that once seemed stable and predictable had turned into chaos that I didn't know how to handle. Michael took a step back, as if creating an invisible barrier between us. He saw his eyes darting around, and I understood that he, like me, felt the guilt of what had transpired, yet couldn't deny the pull between us. "We need to talk," he finally said, his voice soft but firm. "This shouldn't have happened." We both know that I nodded, feeling a tightening pain inside. He was right. This kiss shouldn't have happened, but it did. And now we both had to live with that knowledge. I couldn't figure out how to go on pretending everything was normal, as if nothing had happened between us. "I know," I replied, trying to keep my emotions under control, but what now? He looked at me, and I saw in his eyes the same anguish tearing me apart. He wanted to answer, but at that moment we heard the front door open and our hearts froze. It was James. He had returned earlier than I expected. I felt a cold sweat cover my body and tried to appear as calm as possible. Michael immediately changed his expression, regaining his former composure. "Emily, I'm home," James's voice called out as he headed toward us. In the living room, Michael nodded at me as if signaling that the conversation was over and took a step aside to leave. I remained where I was, feeling a storm of fear and guilt brewing inside. James entered the room, and I met his gaze, trying to hide all my emotions. "Hi, darling," he said, coming over to me and kissing me on the cheek. "Is everything okay?" I nodded, unable to respond with words. My heart was still pounding, and I feared that James might sense something was wrong, but he seemed to notice nothing suspicious. He was too absorbed in his thoughts and stories about his day at work. Michael stayed in the room for a few more minutes, listening to James's conversation, but soon excused himself, saying he needed some time alone. I watched him, feeling the pain and fear tighten within. What would happen next? The evening passed in a strange atmosphere. I tried to act as usual, but I kept finding my thoughts drifting back to Michael. James was unaware and seemed pleased that the family was together again. We watched a movie, had dinner, and talked about daily matters, but inside me a storm raged when night fell and we went to bed. I couldn't sleep lying next to James. The first felt suffocated by guilt. I understood that my actions were unforgivable, that I had betrayed his trust, but I couldn't get rid of the image of Michael. His kiss, his touch, it was like poison that had seeped into my blood and wouldn't let me rest. I got out of bed and, trying not to wake James, left